I'm here to talk to you about the importance of stacking sats for our liberty and why we must mine, not I want to mine, but really we need to. I'm going to go through the reasons for that. But before I do, I was reflecting on how this was occurring on Independence Day weekend, right? July 4th, as we like to call it, Independence Day. And I'm convinced, you may not be, and that's totally fine. We can agree to disagree, but I'm convinced that Bitcoin was drafted and Satoshi Nakamoto came from the US as an American. The reason why I think that is because there's a unique set of cultural values that Americans have and that were granted when we declared our independence from the tyranny of the British. And those unique cultural values combined with the frontiersman mentality that you can find still present here in Juneau led to what I believe is the right context for which somebody could think and dream up Bitcoin. Because we know that people had tried for about 20 years before to craft Bitcoin and were unable to. They didn't call it Bitcoin, but there's many attempts to create a digitally native form of cash. And I think July 4th is important because that was a predecessor event that was a necessary precondition for Bitcoin. So I'm appreciative that this is occurring on Independence Day and just wanted to point that out. Secondly, when Satoshi dropped the white paper in October of 2008, that was the first time. So the US, July 4th was the Declaration of Independence from UK tyranny. I see October 31st as the declaration that Bitcoin is post the tyranny of money. We have uncensorable transactions now, right? So building off of that, and we think of that as a 0 to 1 innovation, absolutely is, but what's often not recognized is when we mined the first block, there was a second 0 to 1 innovation that occurred because now democratizing the creation of money was available and accessible to all. That means any person in this room that decides to follow the rules of the network and mine has the ability to create money. So it's the decentralization of the money printer, in essence, is what Bitcoin offers, Bitcoin mining offers. And I think that's lost on a lot of us. And there's reasons for that. I'm going to go into it. But I said Bitcoiners must mine. And I think when I say that, there's a common question that comes up for many of us is, what is a Bitcoiner? I'm going to give you my definition. And I don't think it's the definition that is commonly held, and that's okay. We don't all have to agree on it. There's lack of consensus on this one. But I see it as a person who voluntarily decides to save Bitcoin instead of fiat. And that is an important distinction, the voluntary I've highlighted there, because you have to choose it on your own. Right? You have to go through the work necessary to get there. In the earlier years, it was much harder to get to the point of realizing, oh my gosh, if I save Bitcoin, it's less likely to erode and fritter away, the melting ice cube analogy, than if I save fiat, which is inflation is going to erode the power of that purchasing power of my savings over time. But we now have greater educational materials, and it's easier to make that leap, but you still need to voluntarily accept that Bitcoin is a better form of savings than fiat. And when you do, there's some shifts that happen. I'm going to talk about those in a moment. But I think it's important to talk about why we save, because cross-culturally, again, I've lived outside the US for a decade now, and I can say this from lived experience, the reasons why we save are almost universal. Across cultures, and these are for the big life events. So we think of emergencies as the first reason why we need to save, and I know that's number 5 on that list, but the reason why I have it number 5 is because I think it's the least important of the life experiences. That's like step 1 in the game of life, right? We need to have something set aside so if something unexpected comes up, we have the ability to cover it. But more importantly is the savings unlock specific biological events for us. So one is we raise our families and our kids need to have shelter. And so our savings as parents help us or our kids, maybe they go off and they rent for a little while and build their own savings to put shelter over their head. But you gotta have a shelter in this world. And so we save to be able to provide that for ourselves. We save so that we can help our children get educated, because that education helps them have the economic opportunity to save for their future. Marriages, right? So that's where the community comes together and recognizes two people are going to put themselves together to build a family for the future. And those are costly events that require savings. And then retirement, right? So if we're lucky, we've lived a great life, kids, grandkids, all of those things, and we're sailing off into the sunset, and we have some way to pay for our care and not be a burden on our kids, and that requires savings. So those are the reasons why we save. But there's some specific things that hard savings does psychologically, and I think these are super important to acknowledge. And I say hard savings, we talk about hard money, so I'm borrowing some language when I talk about hard savings. But we know, again, that ice cube isn't melting when we save in Bitcoin, right? The money printer, the US Federal Reserve, isn't debasing our savings. And as a result, we get a sense of safety and security, that we've got that optionality for our future and that our savings provides. And that optionality gives us hope. We're not stuck. And that's important that we have hope because it keeps us forward looking and it extends our time horizon. So if you are thinking about savings and what you're going to do with savings, you're naturally thinking about the future. And if we think about the future, I'm convinced that aligns us with our higher selves. What do I mean by that? Almost everybody in this room that I know will readily acknowledge that we are more than our five senses. So whatever you want to call that aspect of ourselves, I see it as timeless. And the more that our time horizons extend out, the more we align with that timeless aspect of ourselves. And that's super important because when we're aligned with our higher selves, we operate at our best. You can look back in human history and see that the times in which we thought with the longest time horizons were the times that we behaved the best as a civilization. It's a civilizing force. Okay, so that's all going to lead to freedom. That's all precursor to mining. Now, I wanted to establish what a Bitcoiner is because that has actually changed. Well, that hasn't changed, but how we get Bitcoin has changed over time. And this is a bit of Bitcoin history that I think we need to know more of and spend time thinking about because there's been a fork in the timeline of Bitcoin, and it started somewhere around 2012. So from 2009 to 2012, if you were running the Bitcoin software, you were mining. There was no separation. The software helped you mine, and that's how most of the early Bitcoiners got their Bitcoin, is they were mining it. Somewhere around 2012, and I would argue, though I wasn't around for this part of Bitcoin's history, that it was about the time that Coinbase opened doors and gave us an easy way through a customer experience to buy Bitcoin, that we shifted from mining to acquire our Bitcoin to buying our Bitcoin. And when we made that shift, there were some unintended consequences. And those unintended consequences, I believe, are just now being played out in a way that's becoming really observable. So what are those? Well, first of all, when we separated and decided to go buy instead of mine our Bitcoin, we divided the community. And you can see this. We have users and devs on one side, and we have a mining community. If you go to a mining conference, you'll find very few Bitcoiners there, just as you will find very few miners at a Bitcoin conference. And that is natural. It's sort of obvious in hindsight that that would happen, but if you separate mining as the main source of acquisition from how the masses are acquiring their Bitcoin, of course there's going to be a natural separation in those two communities. So the natural consequence of that is the user and dev community has a bit of mining amnesia from my perspective. Just don't understand the complications and specifics of mining and bring their priors to the table on what they think mining is without having that direct experience. So